The book, of course, is the Revelation, and it is a forbidding book. If you just sit down and begin to read it, chapters 1 through 3 are interesting and, not too difficult. But when you get into chapter 4, things start to get more complicated, and as you go through the book. And then, of course, there's the various different ways of reading the Revelation, and it can be bewildering. So you write, and I like this passage very much, which is why I want to quote it for the listener and for you. So you write, on the surface, Revelation is a puzzling, even troubling book. A butchered lamb with 7 eyes talks. Horse-like grasshoppers with scorpion tails roam about. A 2-headed dragon waits to swallow a newborn baby. It's no surprise that Revelation is so often misunderstood or ignored altogether. But then you go on to point out that the Revelation itself says that we should hear it, and that there's a blessing for hearing and reading the Revelation. So how does the listener get from trepidation to appreciation?
Yeah, and, kind of back to earlier, I think the secret to Revelation is the Old Testament. What we see John doing here is no different from what Ezekiel and Isaiah, Daniel, Zechariah, and is done in some of the Psalms, is that he is speaking in Old Testament ways, with his imagery and those sorts of things. The other thing I think is important about Revelation is Revelation's not here to sort out our end times view so much. The New Testament makes clear what the end times are. The Lord's coming as a thief in the night, and we wait, and he can come at any time. After the Pentecost, there is no further acts of redemption that we look for except the second coming. And so we get our New Testament eschatology from the New Testament, and Revelation isn't here kind of as a eschatological lesson book. Rather, it's really a book of comfort for the suffering church in a world that hates the church and wants to kill the church. It is a comforting to those suffering saints saying, you might lose your life. The world will hate you, but don't fret. Jesus has already won. The victory's yours. And in our suffering lives, it often looks like the church is losing. In our struggle with sanctification, it can feel like we're losing. And Revelation takes us outside of ourselves and says, no, that's part of bearing the cross. That's part of the endurance. But your Savior's already won. The victory's already his. So there's no if, and, or buts about the end of the story. Spoiler alert, Jesus is conquered. And that's why it's sad when we turn this book into a weird sort of predicting code for reading headlines, which is speculation and only tends to make people afraid, versus what the book wants to be. Blessed are those who hear and read the book as a source of comfort and assurance. And so that's why I just love the book of Revelation. And to see such a poignant, helpful, encouraging book for the saints, to see this used as speculation or ignored, left on the shelf, is just sad. And just to bring it back and let it do what it's supposed to do, and that is glorify Christ and encourage us in the faith until the end.
Mentioned that the Revelation was written under the reign or during the reign of Domitian. And the letters to the 7 churches at the beginning of the book locate the original context of the book. So just briefly, give us a sense of what have the Christians been experiencing prior to Domitian, for example, under Nero. But what was life like for the Christians in what we think of as Turkey in Asia Minor in the early 90s when the Apostle John is given this vision and then writes this down for us, as you say, for our encouragement?
Well, I think what's unique about Domitian in the 90s, AD 90s, is that before this time, persecution of the church was sporadic and local. I think Paul in Acts and his mission journeys is a good example. He goes to Philippi and he gets thrown in jail. And then he goes to, Thessalonica and he gets persecuted. Goes to Berea, no persecution. It's hit and miss. And so up to this time, really, the Christian church is kind of part of Judaism. Rome doesn't know what quite to do with it. They have certain peace in certain cities, and they're persecuted in other places. So under Nero, the Christians suffered under Nero for a time. Of course, they were just an excuse for Nero to blame somebody for a fire. They weren't actually, they weren't persecuted so much for their faith. They were just a scapegoat because people didn't like them. But under Domitian, there was a more empire-wide push Again, it wasn't everywhere, but it was more empire-wide. There was holes or safe spots where there wasn't persecution, but persecution increased. And part of this also is emperor worship. Emperor worship continued to grow through the first century. You know, it was smaller under Augustus, not really full emperor worship under Augustus. It became more after his death. And each emperor worship kind of grew and flourished. And so with the growth of emperor worship, more demanding on loyalty oaths to worship emperor, and then the church refusing to do that, there became more of a crisis. And so the persecution came from the synagogue. It came from the Roman Empire. And there in Asia Minor, we definitely have flare-ups. The church is used to suffering, but this was a really intense and heated up time for them. And so where the world was really flexing its muscles in hatred against the church is kind of the environment in which the book of Revelation is written.
So there really is a terrific relevance of the apocalypse, the revelation for Christians, but not necessarily for the reasons that people often think. As you say, people have a tendency to read the revelation against the context of contemporary headlines, when in fact we need to be reading it differently. And yet, inasmuch as it is a book written for suffering Christians, and to say to them, listen, I know you're puzzled about why things are going the way they are, but Jesus is ascended, he's ruling, he's reigning, he's in charge of all this. None of this is happening outside of his control, and he is coming again. And you need to rest in that. And as we think about, for example, Christians in China, where it has become, again, really difficult, or if you're a Christian in Lagos, Nigeria, being chased by Islamists. And you and I know people to whom this has happened. Or if you're a Christian in Saudi Arabia, or any number of places, or in Iraq or Iran. These are all places where, and maybe perhaps us a little bit now, who knows how things will go, those people certainly can read the Revelation and say, yes, we understand about the dragon coming after the newborn baby. And you begin looking forward to the return of Christ in a renewed way, and you find comfort in the imagery. So last thing, you give some principles for reading the Revelation, which I found helpful. Walk us through that briefly. So the principles for reading and understanding what is often a difficult book, the Revelation.
Yeah, I mean, the principles I lay out there are several. These are kind of introductory ones. But, you know, the first is the main theme that Jesus has conquered. To keep that basic thesis, that's what's all, you know, even when it gets weird and we're like, what's going on? That thesis is still crucial. Two numbers, I think we just need to remember that all the numbers in Revelation are symbolic. It doesn't mean that they don't have maybe a literal referent in the text, but the overall meaning of the number is symbolic. So the seven spirits or the seven horns, these are, you know, images of perfection or completion, or in the case of the dragon, divine imitation in a profane way. The next is, and this is the main thing I focus on, is what I call the portraits. That the book of Revelation is a series of portraits of the church age between Christ's first coming and second coming. And so I use the analogy of, if you're in an art museum, and sometimes you'll see a scene where there's a farmhouse in a painting, and one painting shows the farmhouse from the south and during the summer, and the next one from the north during the winter. And you got 4 or 5 of those from different times and different angles. And what that does is it shows you the same farmhouse from different perspectives to deepen your understanding. And so what we have here is these portraits, which are what we call recapitulatory. They go back and tell again what that's already happened. And they show us, this is Christ's first coming, this is what he's doing in the middle, and this is his last coming. And the perspective and the angle and the theme can focus, but that's the basic image. And I lay those out, which I think is crucial to kind of then seeing that we can't date Jesus' second coming by this, because these are just pictures that recapitulate, show the same thing, you know, numerous times through the book.